Hi everyone, Azriel Knight here with another episode of Days of Night. Today we take a bit of a trip down memory lane. I have reviewed many Canon cameras over the years, in total at least 14, and I'll leave a link in the description if you want to go through the whole playlist. Today though, we'll just be focusing on EOS, more specifically my top 5 favorite Canon EOS film SLRs. Even though I made the switch to Nikon in the last year, I still have a soft spot for Canon and I'm quite familiar with how they work and feel. I think they have a lot of fantastic models to choose from, and the EF mount lenses can be found pretty easily. With all that being said, let's get started. Starting off on today's list at number 5, the Rebel 2000, aka the EOS 300, aka the KISS 3. The Rebel 2000 slips in at number 5 on my list mainly because it's an inexpensive way to get into EOS cameras. I've still managed to find a few of these in thrift stores at a good price since my initial review. A love it or hate it feature is that it pulls the entire roll of film and shoots backwards into the canister. So as previously mentioned and at the top of my list, it's got autofocus and semi-automatic exposure settings. I'm not so hot on the idea of needing two CR2 batteries. That can cost up to 40 bucks. Also, this plastic hinge here is eventually just going to snap right off. I don't know how I feel about it pulling out the entire roll. It does have the advantage of saving your photos in case the back flips open for any reason. But if for any reason a light leak starts on this thing, then keeping it in a bag isn't going to help, because the whole roll is going to be exposed to that leak while it rewinds back into the canister. If you're fussy about your negatives, this is going to mess up the numbering system a little bit. In this case, my first frame is number 24 and it's flipped upside down. It is all plastic and it's a bit smaller than I'd like. It's noticeably lighter than my 24-105. And this is probably just human error, but my exposure wasn't always what I expected it to be. I'm going to read the manual and see if I can gain some insight there. Despite these minor hangups, I do have what I'm looking for. Coming in at number 4 is the EOS 3, which was loaned to me by a viewer, and it's a beast of a camera. Maybe a little too much from what I remember, as it's heavier than it needs to be. Okay, first thing that I have to mention, if I haven't said it already, this camera is massive. It is basically the same size as my Canon 5D Mark II. And it's noticeably bigger than my main SLR at the moment, the Canon EOS 30V. The controls on here, as mentioned earlier, are really intuitive. The one problem I did have is that when I wanted to bracket my shots, I had to hold these two buttons down at the same time, and I had to kind of do this claw type deal. I had to take my hand off the lens and press these two buttons like so. Maybe there was an easier way, but yeah, that was my one issue, is that these shift buttons, particularly changing the drive mode and bracketing here, you kind of got to do this weird pinch. I always love, of course, having an additional dial on the back that allows me to do exposure compensation if I want to. If I'm in full manual mode, I also don't need to use some kind of shift button. I like how it has a sync port. I almost did a studio test instead of an outdoor test on this camera actually, and it's got a trigger here. Now I've got a trigger. I'm kind of curious to see if it works. Yep. That's fantastic. Yeah, I gotta say, overall, this is a really solid camera. Not to mention I had this out in a Canadian winter and it didn't even skip a beat, which is more than you can say for a lot of digital cameras nowadays. I think where this camera falls a little bit short for me is its sheer size. I don't think you need a camera quite this big to accomplish everything that you need to in a film SLR. However, if you do come across one at a garage sale, be sure and snatch it up if it's at the right price. Overall, it's a workhorse, and you know, my only complaint is that it might be too much camera for me. That's a good thing too. The EOS 1 comes in at number 3. It was the first major flagship of the EOS line, so it still has a few bugs to be worked out in terms of button placement, like I mentioned in the EOS 3 review, but overall it's a good build, solid features, and feels good in the hand. The thing that I immediately noticed is that there is no dial on the top here. You hold down the mode button like a shift key and then dial in whichever preset you want, whether it be aperture priority, shutter priority, manual, etc. And on the back here, it's a bit more familiar. You've got your back dial, and you can turn that on and off with this switch here. And then you've got your on-off mode here, and your film rewind there. The only thing that I don't like about the EOS 1 is that it's not a dial on top. It's a shift mode type deal. I also mentioned that the EOS 1 gave me a warning that I was going to be underexposed, and I couldn't even tell you which shot that was, so it couldn't have been that underexposed, or it just worked out for the sake of the shot. But it does give you a warning. It'll blink. The aperture will blink and shutter priority if you're not going to get a proper exposure, and it's going to let you shoot anyway, so you should watch out for that. And you know, out of all the camera companies, I'm most familiar with Canon. I shot with a 5D Mark I, I've shot with the Canon 50D, I shot with a Canon 5D Mark II, a Rebel XSI, you know, all those digital SLRs, and you know, it's very similar. And then I've also had an EOS 3, an EOS 5, and a Rebel 2000, and an Elan 2E, as well as the original Elan. So I've really got my bases covered when it comes to Canon, and this one's no different. You're going to notice that it's heavier. You're going to notice that the advanced drive sounds kind of old. I find that the later models, they're quieter. And you can see that they're still sort of figuring out, you know, their style as far as the top placement of the buttons, as I mentioned, you know, the dial. At number 2 is the original Elan, aka the EOS 100. For its combination of features and price, you can still get one for under $100 shipped on eBay. It's one of the first Canons to incorporate the top dial, so if you're really set on that, this is the model for you. The first thing that I want you to know is that if you're a Canon user, especially a Canon EOS user, there's nothing new here. You are going to go into this just knowing how to use the camera, basically. There's a dial on the front for your primary adjustments, and there's a wheel on the back for your secondary. So if you're in aperture or shutter priority, the wheel on the back is going to adjust your exposure compensation, and the dial on your front will adjust your aperture or shutter speed respectively. So yeah, no surprises there. I think it's interesting how there's easy access to auto exposure bracketing by use of the dial instead of using a dedicated button. I don't know if it's necessarily the best choice in the world. I would say that it's not the worst. It certainly makes it user-friendly. You just dial up to auto exposure bracketing, use your main dial to basically dial into whatever you want the exposures to bracket to, and then dial back to aperture priority, shutter priority, whatever you're using. The thing that I found interesting is that it's just going to fire all 3 shots for you, whereas you may have noticed with my Nikon F100 that you have to fire the shutter each time yourself. Now, I double-checked the custom functions on the EOS Elan, and there isn't a way to turn that off. So that's one thing that you should note, is that if you bracket your shots, all you got to do is press the shutter button once, and it's going to fire all 3. Now, that might be a good thing, that might be a bad thing. Generally speaking, when people bracket their shots, they want to fire them all right away in order to capture what they need to get before the lighting changes, or before anything moves, or what have you. So, but I can't think of any instance right now where that would be a detriment to the camera, but there's probably, but there probably is. Overall, the Canon EOS Elan or EOS 100 is a really robust little camera, and I think that if you happen to come across one and you say have a DSLR Canon and you want to use your lenses for a film camera, this camera is just as good as any other. And coming in at the number 1 spot is the EOS 30V, aka the Elon 7N, aka the 7S, which was my main 35mm camera for a short time. I've had several, and it's a beautiful camera. Marketed in 2004, it's ruggedly built and just the right amount of features and hits the Goldilocks size for me. Not too big, not too small. A lot of this is going to be familiar to you. You have your one shot, your AI focus, and your AI servo. You've got single shot, multiple shots, as well as a self timer. If you've owned an Elan before, it's got eye controlled focus, and you've got other stuff like exposure compensation, exposure bracketing, and red eye reduction if you want to use the pop-up flash. You've also got your spot, center weighted, and evaluative metering. You have the ability to record your date. I didn't turn that on though. I might try it at some point. It feels really similar to DSLRs that I've handled in the past, like the Canon 5D Mark II, which I'm shooting on right now, the Canon T2i, even the XSI. It's slick, it feels really good in the hands. There's lots of tactile buttons. Everything feels really snappy and precise and well built. Now when I hold the EOS Rebel 2000, it feels like really light, really plasticky, kind of janky, and you can definitely tell the difference just by holding it. So let me tell you about the only problem I've found with it so far. So normally on a modern DSLR, when you want to change your focus points, you would press this button here, which has this focus point icon, and then you would use the main dial in order to cycle through them. But in the case of this camera, you activate the button and then you use the D-pad on the back, which I found kind of interesting. Now there is an advantage to that, is that it's more precise once you get used to it and you can select which one you want. Like if I press up, it'll automatically choose the top focus point, and so on and so forth. Whereas the dial, you have to kind of cycle through them in a clockwise or a counterclockwise fashion, which to me seems a little faster overall, because this is faster than using these buttons on the back here. We all have cameras we regret selling, and this was one of those for me. During this time, if I found an issue, any issue with the camera, I just moved on. In this case, the camera was scratching my film. These days, I just get my cameras serviced, which is more expensive, but gives me peace of mind. And that's it for today's list. Be sure and let me know which is your favorite Canon EOS camera in the comments section. Just because I'm a Nikon shooter doesn't mean I'll stop reviewing Canon. I still have a couple of lenses kicking around just for that purpose. And if you like what I do around here, consider a small PayPal donation. Even $5 goes a long way. I also have a Patreon with perks like early access, free prints, and your name in the credits. You can also follow me on Instagram and Twitter, and until next time, stay classic.